Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to JW3 Israel-Iran briefing in partnership with the Jewish News. My name is Claire Ahrens. I'm the Learning and Engagement Producer here at JW3, and we're delighted this morning to be joined by David Patrikarakos, who is joining us live from Jerusalem in Israel. David is a special correspondent for the Daily Mail, and he's author of Nuclear Iran, The Birth of an Atomic State, and the Daily Mail's Apocalypse Now podcast. And we're also delighted to have David in person at JW3 in September. We've got half an hour. David is going to talk to us about what's been going on in the last couple of weeks. If you do have any questions, please do pop them in the chat and we'll do our best as we can to answer them. But David, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to speak to JW3. I thank you all for taking the time to listen to me today. Now, we are recording this. I was told to remind you, so hopefully we are recording this. So I came to Israel about 10 days ago. So yeah, pretty much 10 days ago. So we're talking about just after those initial Israeli strikes. Well, there were more than strikes, coordinated Israeli military attack on Iran, which encompassed obviously strikes against its facilities. It encompassed a cyber attack against certain Iranian military capabilities and facilities, and of course the fairly surgical elimination of key nodes of Iran's command and control. As I said, or I think as I wrote, it was like a cross between the Godfather baptism scene where Michael Corleone whacks all of his enemies and the 1967 preemptive strike on the Egyptian Air Force. Tactically speaking, it was an extraordinary military operation, the 13th of June and the days that followed after it. I think if we're looking at this from a strategic point of view, it was very, very important for Israeli deterrence. Now, the atrocities of October the 7th, register on many, many levels. But one thing I would say is it did a lot of damage for Israel's brand in terms of security. Now, I spend a lot of time in Ukraine. I've been covering the war there for 11 years. It started in 2014, not 2022, remember. And actually, this leads into a broader point that I'll mention briefly. It is quite interesting that Israel is, to many in Western Europe, anathema. When you go to Eastern Europe, they see it as a model. They actually love Israel, and they see, if you're Ukraine is not a small state, but it's surrounded by Russia. So Ukraine, the Baltic states, Georgia, all of these states in Eastern Europe see themselves surrounded by this massive hostile Russia. They see Israel surrounded by enemies as analogous. So they see it as a model. Many times Ukraine is including both President Zelensky and before him President Poroshenko talks about modeling their army on Israel's. So my point is that I was in Ukraine shortly after October the 7th. The Ukrainians like, we can't believe this. We thought the Israelis were invincible. What happened? So I think in terms of restoring Israeli deterrence, I think this began when they struck the Hamas leader in Tehran, whose name escapes me. It wasn't Sinwar, it was the other one. It'll come back to me. And then really increased with the Pages operation that decapitated, in some cases almost literally, Hezbollah. And I think the 13th of October really was a great day, I would say, in the history of the Jewish armies in terms of what it achieved tactically. Since then, we have seen something unprecedented. Now, unprecedented is one of those words that is used in journalism all the time. But I would suggest that in this instance, it's fair. The United States directly striking the Iranian nuclear facilities. Donald Trump ordering that when Barack Obama and George W. Bush obstinately and unwaveringly refused to do it. Let's not forget the Israelis have been trying to goad the United States into striking Iran's nuclear facilities for 20 years because the Israelis do not have the massive ordnance penetrators, those huge bunker-busting bombs that are needed to take out the Fordo enrichment facility buried so deep underground and into the mountainside. Now, whether that's happened, we'll come to in a minute. But what we saw on the day of the US strikes was something we've never seen before. It's this, not only a US direct strike on Iran for Israel, essentially, or in the service of, I would say, goals that Israel has asked the US to do for decades, but also joint US and IDF maneuvers. They fought together because the IDF was also striking that day. That we've never seen before. So I would say...
David, I'm just going to interrupt you 1 minute. Is there any chance you can come a bit closer to the microphone?
Sure.
You're a little
Sorry.
bit quiet. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
sorry. Okay,
That's
can you
much
hear
better.
that?
Thank you.
Is that
Yeah,
much
it's
better?
much better.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, so I would say then that these last 10 days have been fairly extraordinary. I would say that geopolitically and yeah, globally, that what we're seeing here really does have ramifications that are genuinely global. Let's not forget, Iran is the geopolitical ordering principle of the Middle East. It's a country of 90 million people. It sits between the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. It's an educated population, and it's a creative and dynamic population that is essentially penned in by a brutal and barbaric regime. So we've seen extraordinary things over the last 10 days or so. The question is, what happens now? Now, the one thing I am going to say most immediately, I would say, is this. I've heard one or two people talking about this war in the past tense. I've heard people talking about the 12-day war. Michael Oren was on the former Israeli ambassador to the United States and historian, very, very smart man, kept talking about this in the past tense. I want to make one thing clear. Yeah, we have a ceasefire at the moment, and as I'm sure you all know, the literal definition of a ceasefire is a temporary truce. What we have seen is not the end of the Iran-Israel war. We have not witnessed a Waterloo. We've witnessed an extremely important event in what is an ongoing war. This war is not over. We need to understand this. Regime has not fallen. And this is a war that did not begin on the 13th of June. It is a war that did not begin on the 7th of October. Personally, I think you can probably say it began in 1982 when 1,500 members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard were sent to Lebanon's Bekaa Valley to set up what became Hezbollah. And that brings me to a wider point that I want to make. And it's something that I've picked up a lot of flack about in the media. Now, we can talk about Gaza. We can talk about the need to respond to October the 7th, which I entirely agree with. But there are also questions around Gaza. There are, questions about occupation, all of these things that are perfectly legitimate. When it comes to Iran, what I see is complete moral clarity. Iran is a country that Israel does not have a border with. Israel occupies no Iranian land. Israel has never, until Iran essentially started on it, attacked Iran. What Israel has faced from Iran is a state that it was very, very, very strong allies with under the Shah. When the Shah fell, Israel remained desperate to retain relations with the Islamic Republic and even helped Iran in these early stages of the Iran-Iraq war against Iraq. It is facing a state that has pretty much since its inception decided to wage proxy war against the state of Israel. Now, there is an ideological component to it. It is also, however, very, from an Iranian point of view, cynical and logical geopolitical strategy. Iran is a Persian Shia state in an overwhelmingly Arab Sunni Middle East. It is de facto isolated, which, by the way, is why Israel is a Jewish state and Iran is a Persian Shia state are, if such a thing exists, natural allies in the Middle East. But we'll come to that. But it uses the Palestinian cause to lessen that isolation amongst Arab populations who see their own regimes, many of whom have made peace with Israel, as weak and traitorous. So with that in mind, Iran has essentially conducted a decades-long proxy war against the state of Israel, as we know. Its policy was to encircle Israel with that so-called ring of fire. And at some point, if we want to look at what is the apotheosis, I would say, of Iranian power, I would say it's probably December 2023, and Israel is fighting Hamas in Gaza, the Iran proxy, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Iran proxy, the Houthis in Yemen, the Iran proxy. Behind them stands Bashar al-Assad, funneling arms and cash to Hezbollah through Syria. And that, I would say, Israel was fighting on 5 fronts. That was the peak of Iranian power. What has happened today since then, of course, is a recalibration of the Middle East. The axis of resistance, the so-called axis of resistance, thought that October the 7th would rebalance the Middle East, and they were right. The thing is, they didn't realize it would end up balancing in Israel's favor. A lot of people ask me, why did Israel strike now? A lot of people say, well, this is merely about Benjamin Netanyahu's personal domestic political problems. And my answer is always the same. Look, that undoubtedly plays a role. I'm not going to say it doesn't. In the end, October the 7th has his name on it because he's the prime minister. And the further he can get away from that temporarily and in terms of geopolitical events, the better for him. But there are
David,
many
sorry, can you just come a bit closer to the
still.
microphone again?
Okay.
Sorry, it's getting a little quiet. So yeah, if the closer you are, it's much better. Thank
Okay.
you.
Right. I just don't want to just basically cram my face right into
That's all right.
deal with it
That's okay.
face up. But there are many timelines here. Okay. It is simplistic and facile to say this is purely about Benjamin Netanyahu's personal political problems, not least because what are the timelines here? First of all, June the 17th, 13th, as we know, required Israeli operatives, or rather Israeli surrogates. I don't think there are a lot of Jewish boys running around in Iran. There may be one or two coordinators, but those people on the ground are going to be Iranian opposition. And it has taken months, if not years, to get those assets into place. So, in the end, any Israeli politician will be guided by the IDF and Mossad as to what they can do. And those timelines have taken, as I say, months, not years. Incidentally, it's very interesting to me to see the relative freedom of movement Israel had inside Iran. I do not believe that even 10 years ago it would have had equivalent freedom of movement. And that says something to me very clearly that hatred of the regime is now even greater than at any other point in the Islamic Republic. Which brings me to my next point. What now? Okay, Israel has done a very, very good kinetic tactical job of taking out, humiliating the Islamic Republic. But the Islamic Republic is still there. The regime is still there. We also now hear that it's likely that the nuclear facilities, Fordo especially, was not destroyed. To be clear, I'm sure you will know this, but in 1981, Israel struck Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor Osirak. This was a single above-ground reactor. The Iranians learned from this. They built their program as an anti-Osirak. They spread out all their facilities across their country, which is far larger than Iraq, and they buried them very deep underground. As I say, people thought Israel would never strike the Iranian facilities because it didn't have the tech to get those bunker busting bombs right down and destroy the facilities. America did. It used several of them, but now appears that it may not have destroyed the subterranean enrichment facility at Fordo. That's the key one, which is, of course, problematic. Donald Trump, being Donald Trump, said the nuclear sites have been completely obliterated. US intelligence seems to disagree. More worryingly, trucks were seen leaving the Fordo facility a couple of days before the strikes. Now, we can assume, or it is being assumed, or there is a quite high likelihood that this was stockpiles of enriched uranium. Enriched uranium is your core material to build a nuclear bomb. Now, in and of itself, you can't do it. You need things around it. First of all, you need to enrich it more. That uranium that Iran has is to 60%. To weapons grade, you need to get it to about 90%. You also need to put a payload and several other technical things I won't go into because it's boring. So it is possible that Iran retains an ability to make a bomb. Now, given that satellite imagery of those trucks is in the media, you'd assume that the Israelis were on top of it. You'd hope so anyway, and the Americans. But as of now, it does seem that Fordo has not been destroyed and that there may be uranium somewhere in Iran. From the Iranian point of view, they're also going to say we were not in violation of the NPT, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. So why should we not just go for a bomb? People are kind of worried about Fordo. If they say, well, if it's not destroyed, the Iranians can start again there. I'm actually less worried about this because in the end, you can create a cordon sanitaire around it. Yeah, you may not, if it's still there underground, any truck that goes towards it, any kind of thing, you can just bomb if we're going to be very, very kind of cynical about it. So the Iranians couldn't start sending men and into Fordo to restart that without everyone noticing. And I think the Israelis will probably just take them out. But the chances of, some uranium and a very, very small nuclear site that we don't know about where they can, manufacture one or two bombs to give, very basic bomb like it was used as Hiroshima 80 years ago, one or two of those, it remains on the table. So that is a concern.
Which actually links to a question, Jacqueline. I think maybe that does answer your question, which was if Iran refuses to engage with the IAEA, how will it be known how much damage has been done to Fordo and other nuclear sites and the missing 400 kilograms of enriched uranium?
Yeah. I mean, unless if it doesn't let them in, look, if it doesn't let them in, the Israelis might bomb them again. But we don't know. but you can make sure that they can't use Fordo again now. You can make sure that nothing goes in there because you can see everything around it. There may be tunnels leading to it, but again, that's, I guess, another unknown. But for the moment, there's a couple of points here. First of all, if it turns out that the facilities were not destroyed, that uranium is somewhere, I think there's going to be a huge wave of criticism on against the United States and Israel. Trump has taken a big risk with this because let's not forget a lot of his MAGA base, well, in fact, a large part of his MAGA base hate this sort of stuff. A lot of them elected Trump to get him out of endless Middle Eastern entanglements. When Trump used the F word, it was quite extraordinary. I've never heard a US president use one in public. I mean, many of them were known for using it every other word privately. People said, oh, he lost control. I actually don't believe that. I don't think Trump loses control, funnily enough. And even though he can't stay on message, he always talks about what he talks about. I think he was making a point that he was absolutely furious with the Israelis for what he perceives as breaking the ceasefire when he'd done so much for them. So if it turns out the facilities aren't destroyed, we're going to expect a lot of criticism against Israel, warmongering. It was pointless anyway. It didn't achieve anything, and so on and so forth. I would probably disagree with that. I would say that the Islamic Republic's program that it spent $500 million of does lie in ruins. Iranian deterrence is shot to pieces, although let's not get too complacent. The Israeli disease is, of course, arrogance and hubris. So I hope that doesn't start to dominate. But speaking to people on the ground here, it doesn't seem to. Iran is far weaker than it was 10 days ago. And more to the point, the world knows it's far weaker than it was 10 days ago. So what now? The Israelis, whatever they say, they want regime change in Iran. They always have. It's been a goal of theirs. Now, they can't say this. And, you speak to Israelis, they'll say that's in the hands of the Iranian people. The problem is this, and I tell the problem by way of an analogy that I always give on this. So I studied at university many years ago in depth the Iranian Revolution. Now, the Ayatollah Khomeini was in exile in Paris, and what would happen is his allies would take cassette tapes, as back in the 70s, of his sermons, and they would smuggle them into Iran. And it took about 2 years to spread these around sufficiently to mobilize people. There were other things that mobilized them. The Shah did stupid things, but about 2 years. But when the Shah fell, Khomeini was there. The opposition was built around the architecture of him, which means when he fell, there was an immediate replacement. Yeah, the Islamists were also there with the Democrats and the communists, and they pushed them out. But it meant there was someone there to take his place. Fast forward, 79 to the Arab Spring, 30 odd years. And Facebook was mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people that it took 2 years to do in Iran in 97 in hours. But because it was, young kids mobilized by social media, it was very diffuse. There was no leader. Mubarak fell. He resigned. And then what happened? There was a massive void. There was no opposition leadership. So what happened? In stepped the Muslim Brotherhood. Now you have Sisi, who is worse than Mubarak in terms of being a strong man. Brings me to my point. Iran, there's absolute hatred of the regime amongst so much of the population, but there's no leadership. The Iranians have no Ayatollah Khomeini. If you get my meaning, I don't mean literally an Ayatollah Khomeini. What's the opposition? It's brave women who are getting killed in the street for wearing a hijab. It's students. People talk about the Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi in DC. I've met him. I don't think he could run a parents' evening, let alone Iran. Maybe he could act as a transitional figure, but for the moment, it remains unlikely. I don't foresee, and with a caveat that you never know. I think right now, even if Khamenei fell, you'd probably just have the IRGC step in. It's a Praetorian state anyway. So regime change, I think, is off the table for the moment. Let's not forget, let's just say, and I'm plucking this figure, that the regime is so popular that 80% of the country is against it. It's 91 million people in Iran. 20% is still 18 million people, a lot of whom are psychopaths and will fight until the end. So it remains very, very problematic. So we have a situation where the regime is degraded, it is wounded. A lot of it will depend on what happens next. Trump has told them, come back to the negotiating table. Come back, make a deal. As I wrote, if there's one thing that Trump likes more than making a deal, it's making a deal with someone that you think you can put over, or he thinks he can put over a barrel. From the Iranian point of view, you've got to think, what is in it for them? I don't think, and they're probably going to calculate, Trump's not going to strike again. He did it once against, a lot of internal opposition. The Israelis can keep striking, but Israel needs, I think, I think if the ceasefire holds, it's good for Israel. Israel does not want to get bogged down in a war of attrition with Iran. Iran is 75 times bigger than Israel, has 91 million population compared to Israel's 9 million. And the population, by the way, that is, yes, the Israelis are used to rocket attacks and this and that, but the Iranians citizens have, they expect less, or they know to expect less from life. And I think in a war of attrition, the longer it goes on, the more it benefits Iran and the more it damages Israel. You walk around the place and the economy is paralyzed. People, the air raids constantly in Tel Aviv, everyone's sleep deprived, the schools are shut. There is a cost that Israel is paying. Beyond the rockets, which, by the way, it's never experienced anything like this. These are not Hamas and Hezbollah rockets. These are ballistic missiles. A friend of mine talks about playing Iranian roulette. You go to the shelter and you come out, and is everything I ever owned destroyed or not? Israel is paying a cost for this. Let's not make no mistake about that. As of now, I think if things stop for the moment, and again, as I said, and I'll finish my monologue with how I began, this is not the end of the war. We did not see a Waterloo. The regime is not defeated. But if this ceasefire holds for now, I think it's the best thing that Israel can hope for. Okay, I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, David. That was really interesting. I'd love to explore a bit more, because I think a lot of the media you hear about, particularly the Iranian women, and there's nobody, like there's no figures coming out of that movement, or just they haven't got the sort of the space to be able to be sort of visible.
Look, I mean, there's no one on the ground that I can tell. There's no opposition figure that I can tell. There's no Navalny. Um, no, I mean, no. I mean, there might be one or two who are prominent within certain circles. Look, we talk about Israel's relative freedom to move on the ground. They've got, and as I say, please, one thing that people seem to think is that when we see the Israelis sent me night vision photos, these commandos walking around, they're not Israelis. They're going to be Iranians. They're going to be like opposition groups. We're being coordinated maybe by one or two Mossad people. So we are seeing more and more people angry. And given the Israelis' relative freedom of action on the ground, I'd be like shocked if they weren't trying to foment some kind or encourage any kind of leadership within the opposition. There is a note of caution, though, I would say. It's always struck me something very interesting, which is the Israelis are fantastic at kinetic warfare, actual proper, the Iranians are fantastic at political warfare. Don't forget that, the strength of Hezbollah was never just its rockets, it was its outreach programs, its schools, all of this. The Israelis, so they're really good at political warfare. The Israelis, if they're going to be trying to help foment regime change in Iran, are going to need to do political warfare, and I think they're not as good at that, to be honest. I think they have less experience of it. So I think that we may start, look, if there is a chance of regime change, we're going to start seeing people coming through now that the regime is weaker than it's ever been. But look, when the regime is weaker than it's ever been, it can become even more brutal.
Okay.
There is, there's like the moral issue here and the strategic thing here. This regime needs to fall for the good of everyone, most of all the Iranian people. If you're looking at it from a really Kissingerian viewpoint from Israel and surrounding countries, maybe a weakened regime that doesn't have the bandwidth to attack everyone else, but it's just focused inwards now on restraining its own population is better for the region. But personally, I wouldn't like to see that because, the Iranian people would pay a price, and it'd be a horrific and terrible price.
Which actually leads to the next question from Richard. Thank you. How near to total collapse is the Iranian regime?
Well, it's like I said, just over the last 10 minutes, there's no Khomeini. I don't see an organized opposition that I think could take the mullahs down. They don't have enough weapons. In the end, in the 1979 revolution, the Shah shot a lot of people in the street, and then they all came out en masse, and he fled. He didn't shoot. He didn't shoot. He still had the monopoly on weapons. He just chose not to massacre everybody. Is the Islamic Republic going to do that? Probably not. I think they probably just keep massacring and massacring. Right now, they retain a monopoly of violence. Look, if the army starts to turn this and that, okay, fine. But I have not seen any evidence en masse of the army starting to turn. And this is why the Revolutionary Guard was set up in the first place. Something we need to understand about the Revolutionary Guard. Funnily enough, it was the guy who became not a reformer but an opponent of the regime in the end. The former Prime Minister Rafsanjani. He let them into the economy. The RSGC across all of the major Iranian industries, from the car manufacturing to real estate to oil. So the Revolutionary Guard was set up by Khomeini to be guardians of the revolution, to avoid the problems of a disloyal army. So they're already ideologically stronger, you'd say, but more than that, they're also economically invested with this regime. So my guess would be they'll never turn. They'll do everything they can to keep in power. So quite far, I would analyze.
Thank you. Okay, a couple more questions. So what impact do you expect Israel's success with Iran to have on the war in Gaza?
I mean, not a huge amount, really. I mean, you can say Iran might be less eager to funnel stuff to Hamas, or less able. But to be honest, Hamas is right now degraded. I think Israel needs to deal with Gaza for the sake of Israel, for the sake of the world, for the sake of the Gazans as well. And I think it's pretty separate. Look, I was in Ramallah yesterday. I went to the West Bank because what I was trying to find out, if I were the Iranians now, Iran, don't forget, fights by proxies. This direct tit for tat with Israel, it's never done before. It did everything it could to fight to avoid this, because it won't win. As I say, unless it draws it out. So it chose to fight by proxies. But Hamas is a twitching corpse in Gaza. Hezbollah is decapitated. Assad is a guest at the dubious hospitality of Putin in Moscow. So if I was Iran, it's all his proxies are gone almost. The Houthis, okay, they're still striking, but I think they're going to get hammered at some point. I'd be trying to surge weapons into the West Bank. That's what I'd be trying to do, to cause chaos there. So I was in the West Bank yesterday trying to see the degree to which this might be possible. Doesn't seem very likely, to be honest, at the moment. The Israelis got it on lockdown, and Palestinians there don't want to get involved because of the comeback that will happen. So I think Gaza's separate. I think, by the way, that Trump will have extracted something from Netanyahu to get involved, and I think there's probably some kind of thing that you've got to wrap Gaza up now, and I think they probably do have to wrap Gaza up now for everybody's sake. So that's my answer.
Thank you. There aren't actually any other questions, so I'm going to use this option to say thank you very much, David, for joining us from Jerusalem and sharing your thoughts. It's such a fast changing environment. I mean, who knows what we'll be talking about in September, and sort of comparing and sharing that. For those of you online, it's so nice to see you again. I hope you have enjoyed our Friday briefing. We've got lots of exciting things coming up at JW3 over the summer as well. But I do wish you Shabbat Shalom, and hopefully a peaceful one. So thank you very much, everybody, and really nice to see you.
Thank you.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.